वेलकम टू आवर नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है। I am Dr. Geeta Kochar, chair for today's special presentation. For this, we have the privilege to invite Professor Carlyle Thayer. He is Emeritus Professor of Politics and a visiting fellow at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, UNSW, the University of New South Wales at the Australian Defence Force Academy, Canberra, Australia. He has served as the Faculty of Military Studies at the Royal Military College, Yuntoon, and also at the Australian Defence Force Academy. He is the founding member of the Vietnamese Studies Association of Australia and has many recognitions to his credit, which I can just mention a few of them. In 2003, he was conferred the Joint Meritorious Service Award for his contributions to the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, US Pacific Command. In April 2015, he was appointed as the Eminent Person by the Department of Defense Australian Civil Military Center, and he has many published works. I cannot name all of them because it's a lot of list that his work done, but just to cite a few of them. Reshaping Regional Relations was published in 2019. Southeast Asia Patterns of Security Cooperation was published in 2010, and Vietnam People's Army Development and Modernization Armed Forces was published in 2009. And he can speak multiple languages apart from English. He knows Thai, he knows Lao, he knows Vietnamese, and I don't know how many more. But today we have invited him for a special lecture on international laws, security, strategic studies, strategic issues, and the major powers. So over to you, Professor, and very warm welcome to our Nation State Dialogue series. I would be very happy to listen to your presentation, and I'm sure our viewers will be very keen to listen to many of the legal issues and the international perspective that you are going to put in the South China Sea issues. Please, sir.
Thank you much, Dr. Geeta Kochar. I must say the last time I visited JNU in person was in 1992. So it's nice to catch up with that great university, even though it has to be virtually. Having thanked you, I'd like to move to my presentation. So next slide, please. I'm going to address three major issues and then close with a brief concluding remarks. To look at the role of international law in the South China Sea, the strategic issues at play here, the major powers, and as I say, conclude. Next slide, please. We start with international law and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, otherwise known as UNCLOS. That is universally referred to by maritime and legal experts as the constitution of the world's ocean. And therefore, whatever happens in the South China Sea has global applicability and vice versa in terms of the evolution of law as disputes are settled and claims are made and resolved. UNCLOS, though, does not deal with sovereignty, who owns a particular rock or island, but it does delimit maritime zones and determine the status of features. And I'll be addressing those features in a subsequent slide. And it addresses the issue of sovereign jurisdiction. Sovereign jurisdiction over resources. In other words, the right of a state, let's say India, to control who can fish in its waters, who can extract hydrocarbons, etc. That's sovereign jurisdiction. The South China Sea is semi-enclosed, and that has a special status in law. The littoral states, those that surround, have a duty to cooperate and to protect the marine environment. And sadly, that's not been the case. And in cases of disputes, if it cannot be settled bilaterally, UNCLOS joins the parties to enter into an arrangements of a practical nature to get on with it, not to aggravate the dispute. So if you can't resolve it through diplomacy, you preserve a kind of status quo. And finally, nation states like China that ratified UNCLOS have subjected themselves to compulsory or binding dispute settlement. And they're given four choices: an international tribunal in law of the sea, International Court of Justice, a special ad hoc arbitral tribunal, and an ad hoc tribunal. And it's the latter that we'll be looking at in my presentation. Next slide, please. Now, under ancient law to the present, the principle is that the land dominates the sea. You only can claim maritime zones from land features. So at low water mark, where the ocean recedes, you can draw a baseline around your country, or Australia's case, the continent. Anything to the land side is your own internal waters. You have sovereignty. But from that baseline outwards, 12 nautical miles, you have a territorial sea in which you exercise sovereign jurisdiction, a contiguous zone, and further out, 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, and a continental shelf. And of course, you can make special claims to extend that continental shelf. And the territorial waters allow for the innocent passage of all ships if they're expeditiously going from point A to point B, including military ships. Now, I mentioned the high seas and international waters. The US uses the case of international waters. Law talks about high seas where nobody has a claim to the, or claims to sovereignty or sovereign jurisdiction over waters beyond rocks. Next slide, please. Now, to demonstrate this, let's pretend that green cup in the center of this graphic is an island. It's above water at high tide. It can sustain human habitation, and it has an economic function. So if we look to the right of that mug, we can see a 12 nautical mile, light blue, that's the territorial sea. And you take it all the way out 200 nautical miles, you have sovereign jurisdiction, so you can explore and exploit hydrocarbons and oil. If it is not an island, that is, it cannot sustain human habitation or an economic function, it's either a rock or a low tide elevation. And a rock protrudes above the water at high tide and is only entitled to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. And if you look to the left of the mug, over to the extreme left, you can see in that dark blue circle, a rock, 12 nautical miles. But beyond that, if it's a low tide elevation, that is, it's completely covered by water at high tide, it can make no claim to a maritime zone. And later, when we look at the 7 artificial features that China has occupied, several of them are low tide elevations. They have no status to claim any maritime zone whatsoever. Next slide, please. So what is the South China Sea? Remarkably, only the International Hydrographical Organization, to which China and most of the countries of Southeast Asia belong, has defined it as the area just above north of Taiwan, extending all the way south to the Straits of Malacca and Singapore. Currently, the debate over a code of conduct in the South China Sea hasn't defined the area that's to be included. It has 4 main geographic features: the Pratas Islands, occupied by Taiwan, which are legitimate islands; the Paracel Islands, completely occupied by mainland China, but claimed by Taiwan and Viet Nam; Macclesfield Bank, which is a submerged feature and therefore not entitled to any zone; and the Spratly Islands, which we'll be focusing on. Now, the entire South China Sea, for an Indian audience, is 3.5 million square kilometers, or just a bit larger than the continental landmass of India itself, to give you a size. Or, as you can see on the list below, Australia is twice as large, roughly, than the South China Sea in area. Next slide, please. In 2009, a deadline was set by the UN Commission on Limits of the Continental Shelf, inviting parties to make claims for an extended continental shelf beyond their 200 nautical mile economic zone. Vietnam and Malaysia put in a joint submission. Vietnam put a separate submission. And for the first time, China submitted a claim based on the 9 dashed lines that you see on this map. This is a copy of the Chinese map, claiming historic rights to all the land features and waters inside that 9 dash line. So that is the commencement, 2009, of real trouble because it overlapped with the exclusive economic zones of littoral states and the occupied features, the rocks, and perhaps an island in the South China Sea. And why I say perhaps, we'll see in a moment. Next slide. So in 2013, as a result of several incidents, including the Chinese occupation of Mischief Reef and Scarborough Shoal, the Philippines made a claim against China under Annex 7 of UNCLOS. They were very clever. They got lawyers, so they did not raise sovereignty issues. They turned it around and said, we're an archipelagic state. What are we entitled to under international law? Every day we're out there and China's making excessive claims on what we think is ours. Do we have a legitimate right to sovereign jurisdiction? What are the status of all these features, occupied and unoccupied, out there? Are they islands? Are they rocks? Are they low tide elevation and submerged banks? These have now been occupied by China that's making claims. The Philippines then argues, well, as an archipelagic state, we sail up and down the coast, north, south, east, west. We have an exclusive economic zone where our fishermen fish. We have a continental shelf, and we're giving contracts to oil companies to explore and exploit hydrocarbons. But yet China keeps telling us to get out. Occasionally it confronts our vessels. So it's interfering with our lawful rights. Can you please tell us, are we correct? Do we have these rights? And finally, please declare the 9 dash line illegal in international law. Next slide. The arbitral tribunal began its hearings in 2015 up to 2016 when it delivered its final award. It's important to say this is a binding process, and UNCLOS makes provision that if a country like China decides not to participate, the tribunal is to go ahead and not make any inference as to the right or wrong of China's claim, and to appoint a judge to represent China. Now, had China participated, it could have nominated its own judge, the Philippines its judge, and together they could have determined who the other judges were. But anyway, in an act of historic irony, the Philippines chose a German judge, and the head of the International Tribunal appointed a Polish judge, two countries that know about maritime disputes. Okay, next slide. What did the tribunal find? In the beginning, it had to consider, do they have competence? And is this a vexatious claim? And the tribunal unanimously found that yes, they had competence to hear what the Philippines was claiming and make a judgment on it. And no, it was not vexatious. It was well-founded in international law. The first statement is that UNCLOS, it's the constitution of the world's ocean, comprehensively allocates rights in the maritime domain. There is no other challenge. There is no other proxy. UNCLOS makes that decision. Then in a surprising judgment, they declared that none of the land features in the Spratlys is an island, but only rocks. And that upset the Taiping Island, Ituabu, that Taiwan occupied, and Taiwan had always thought it was an island. So all of a sudden, Taiwan lost, the 200 nautical mile economic zone, and no other feature, including anything occupied by China, was a legal island. China was in breach of flag state obligations related to the prevention of collisions at sea. That although I haven't mentioned it yet, its fishing boat and Coast Guard, often when they harassed, went further and deliberately rammed ships, even to the point of sinking fishing boats to assert China's right. and this violates international regulations. 2, to build the artificial islands, China gouged out the coral reefs of a very delicate ecosystem that extends well beyond the Spratly Islands, and violated its duty to protect the environment in a semi-enclosed sea. And China extended and aggravated the dispute, meaning that once the Philippines had made the claim, instead of suspending and waiting for a decision, China further militarized, occupied, and pushed its way around during the court proceedings. Thank you. Next slide. So the arbitral award finally concluded that China's claims to historic rights, in yellow, jump down, are contrary to the convention and without lawful effect. So it declared, as the Philippines had asked, to get rid of the 9-dash line as a legal basis of claim. And China and the tribunal argued, look, China, you took part in the discussions that created UNCLOS. You ratified it. UNCLOS today supersedes anything that went before in terms of maritime rights and entitlement. So you're held to the standard of UNCLOS. And finally, what happens when an award is made? Next slide. It's final and without appeal, and it shall be complied with by the parties to the dispute. That's China and the Philippines. Of course, China refused to participate from the beginning. It attacked it viciously, launched massive propaganda campaign without it, and there is no provision in UNCLOS to enforce it. So we're left with a judgment by a tribunal that represents the constitution of the world's oceans that can't be applied. Next slide. So now I have to turn to major powers and strategic issues. The column on the left lists the claimants, China and Taiwan. They both have the same. And China occupies 7 features plus 1, and that's Scarborough Shoal, where China invested in the military sense. They've surrounded it and control who can use the shoal and who can't, and they exclude the Philippines. Taiwan, as I mentioned, had that Taiping Island. Viet Nam occupies 21 features, so they're all rocks. The Philippines 9, Malaysia 5, Brunei none, because Brunei just draws a straight 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone from its coastline, and it's like a rectangle, and it includes no features. Indonesia is in italics because it claims it's not a party to the dispute. Indonesia claims all its maritime boundaries are legal and it will not discuss them with anybody. Indonesia pushed and got the notion of an archipelagic state written into international law, UNCLOS. It is made its exclusive economic zones, territorial sea, in accord with international law, and it won't discuss with China or any other country anybody that makes a claim on its sovereignty or sovereign jurisdiction. If we look closely at this map, 2 communist countries have got red flag, Vietnam with 1 star, China with 5. And then you could see Taiwan red with its stars, that the occupation that I've indicated on the left is intermixed, very close, and very difficult to separate. So you see Filipino flags up in the northeast part. You see Vietnamese flags further to the south, Malaysian flags down off the coast of eastern Malaysia. So interspersed. Next slide, please. In the South China Sea, there are grave differences between China and the United States over estimates of how much oil and liquefied natural gas is there. And China's estimates are 4 to 6 times greater than the United States. When we look at the map here, though, we can see that the hydrocarbon are up in the northern part of the South China Sea or in the southern part of the South China Sea, leaving a gap in the middle. Some specialists have coined the term, it's a donut shape, referring to an American donut. The crust of the donut is near the coast of all the outlying littoral states, and the hollow center of the American donut is where the Spratly Islands are located. So we see over time, oil has been used up quite a bit. And so now the most abundant resource is liquefied natural gas, and it tends to be in the southern part of the South China Sea, bringing Indonesia into the equation as a party to the dispute, despite Indonesia's formal position. Next slide, please. If we look at the fishing, 12% of the world's protein comes from the South China Sea. The waters have been polluted and depleted. Where you see red, it's depleted or overfished. Where you see orange, it's fully fished. And again, green is moderately or underfished. It lies to the south. So over time, for hydrocarbons and for fishes, for those countries that value those resources, the main game, the main area of disputes tend to be in the south. Next slide. Finally, this is on strategic things, although this is an Australian map, but nonetheless, those lines that cross by India and proceed through the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea represents the world's shipping lanes. This is the second busiest sea lane in the world, and there are differences in how you measure 3 to 5 trillion in goods annually that pass through here. So this is a vital artery, and that's why European countries making their presence felt this year with naval power, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, they trade with Asia, and their very livelihoods depend on keeping the region stable so they can prosper and sell goods and buy goods from the region. Next slide. When you come through the Straits of Malacca and cross into the South China Sea, the sea lines bifurcate to the east and to the west. So the one on the west, on the east goes by the Philippines coast, and the others go to the east by Viet Nam and up by the Paracel Island. They carry 1/3 of global trade, and in the estimates here, or that's the value of goods to the South China Sea. The other one was across the Indo-Pacific completely. Next slide. If also the countries, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, are vitally dependent on importing energy supplies. So you can see this green arrow that goes through represents the destiny, and then these little arrows off to the side indicate how much each of those major economies relies on in terms of hydrocarbon resources. And although this is for oil, the same density would apply to liquefied natural gas. So over and over again, I've been trying to highlight the strategic importance of the South China Sea in terms of its resources and in terms of international shipping. Resources for local countries to consider an issue, and global interest. Next slide, please. China has militarized 7 features. It terraformed them by, as I said, gouging out coral, cementing it to existing rocks or low tide elevations. And on 3, like Fiery Cross pictured here, has built 3 3-kilometer airstrips. And an American naval commander says that can take any plane in the world except the space shuttle. You can take a B-52, jumbo jets, and every plane in China's military inventory. And I could bore us all by going through all 7, but here's we see down Fiery Cross Reef, a 3-kilometer long runway. And then China has militarized it by including in red, boxed red, radars and sensor arrays, hangars for jet aircraft and refuelers and bombers, mobile missile shelters, and point defenses. And this has proceeded well beyond 2018. So by the time you get to 2019, it's pretty much completed. Next slide, please. Very rarely at international conferences do I see this issue discussed, but China and the United States are nuclear powers. And in a sense, the doctrine of the Cold War called MAD, mutually assured destruction, still maintains itself. And India as a nuclear power can well understand. If it's no first use, but nonetheless, if you're attacked by a nuclear power, you want the ability to retaliate with such assuredness that no country would want to attack you first. And so you have to diversify your means of delivery to survive a first strike, and nuclear powered and ballistic missile submarines are key. And China has built submarine bases pictured here, but the most important one to us is Hainan Island in the South China Sea, just below the capitalization of SSBN submarines, ballistic nuclear, on Hainan Island in underground caves. They can't go out to the South China Sea and launch a missile that would strike continental United States. They need to go between the channel, the Bashi Straits, between Taiwan and the Philippines, and cross the Western Pacific to get into firing range. So in other words, China knows that the US has many more nuclear weapons, but to survive, they have to be able to strike back if the US should strike first. The reason that's important is this is called the first island chain from Japan south. And where these tight-knit islands are through to Okinawa, the US has a sound underwater system that can pick up nuclear submarines and track them. Therefore, they're useless as a deterrent if America could destroy them. But the one out of Hainan, if it gets out in the Pacific without being detected, could go play a game of hide and seek and therefore be a potent deterrent. So that is a major game when you're looking at all the other reasons why China might be involved in the South China Sea. Next slide. So now to turn to the major powers. And China, since 2013, its People's Liberation Army, including the Navy, has adopted a doctrine of three warfares: psychological, legal, and public opinion, and manipulating the press, using social media through its press statements, through its kind of comments, through its publications, designed to play with your mind. The legal warfare is to constantly enact legislation that's adopted by China's National People's Congress, and then later say when there's a dispute, you're violating our law because it's our territory. And finally, to play on public opinion and to make to build up domestic pressures on any leader that would be anti-China. It pursues these three warfares in its ultimate objectives of really expelling the United States from the first island chain through what's called gray zone tactics. You have warships that are painted gray and Coast Guard ships painted white, but gray zone is talking about using the China Coast Guard, China militia, China fishing fleet to do things, to ram, to intimidate, to occupy features, but keep it short of war and not to have a military vessel involved, which would lead to escalation. So gray zone is a space between peace and armed conflict and those instruments I've just mentioned. The United States pursues a policy of freedom of navigation, operational patrols. The US never ratified UNCLOS, and it claims to challenge the legality of excessive claims by other countries. And India would know recently the US made a challenge there for prior notification and permission. Likewise, all across Southeast Asia, the United States just doesn't challenge China, but it challenges the Philippines, it challenges Vietnam, Malaysia, etc. And the US maintains a hefty naval presence and bombers. Bombers from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean fly all the way up to the South China Sea to take part in naval exercises to demonstrate strategic reach. Bombers from Guam and bombers from continental United States keep coming, and they fly at China's coastline and pull away not to violate Chinese airspace. So what this has given rise to is an action-reaction. Every time the US runs a freedom of navigation, China claims it detected it and expelled it. And both sides conduct muscular exercises at sea with live firing. China's got now 2 aircraft carriers. They home ported in Hainan Island, so the South Sea Fleet is being built up. The US has, over the past year, as many as 3 aircraft carriers operating simultaneously. Now we're entering a worrying patch where the USS Ronald Reagan, homeported in Japan, will leave the region because of the U.S. withdrawal, to cover the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and there will not be an American aircraft carrier present for some time. But this is an action-reaction cycle between the United States and China, flying up close to airplanes that could lead to misjudgment and miscalculation. Next slide. Well, having just discussed the major powers, China and the United States, in a military context, we now move to a new form of legal warfare by China, where China is pressing historical rights, but no longer on the U-shaped line of 2009, but by claiming that there are 4 island groupings that belong to China, and has drawn lines around them to make them a group, calling all the waters inside territorial waters, and then claiming 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And this has set up a conflict between China and all the other claimants, the United States, Australia, and the big 3 in Europe, because they've all put note verbals to this Commission on Limits of the Continental Shelf. And the 4 Shahs are to include the Paratus Islands that I've mentioned, the Paracels, Macclesfield's Branch, which is absurd, it's underwater, and then the Spratlys themselves. So it's a new basis that's been challenged by all the littoral states. So for the first time, there's common legal ground among the claimants and major external powers. Next slide. Oh, I could do that, sorry. And finally, how are we going to solve this, and what kind of order is going to remain? And the new kid on the block, or the new piece of security architecture, is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue that held its first virtual meeting and issued its first statement since it was recreated in 2017. So the Quad, as it's known, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, in alphabetical order, issued a statement in which they mentioned the importance of a free and open Indo-Pacific, a democrat rules-based order unconstrained by coercion, the importance of international law, including UNCLOS in the maritime domain, and maritime security. They offer their support for ASEAN unity and centrality. And because the ministers met virtually, they've now directed that their foreign ministers will meet at least once a year, and an in-person summit should be held before the end of this current year. Next slide. Oh, okay. The Quad wanted to divert the calls that it was an Asian NATO to look at a broad area in which these 4 countries can cooperate. And this is important because they've been fragmented in the past. And now the 4 powers can combine the non-military aspects of national statecraft and apply it. And so we see here, COVID-19 and climate change have received high priority as security issues by the Quad members, plus the everyday issues which they each have to deal with: counterterrorism, disaster relief, and then the positive side of building quality infrastructure. And that's also a criticism of some of the Belt and Road initiatives that China produces, but provide the funding for quality infrastructure, develop critical technologies, and work in cyberspace for rules. Next slide. And so when the Quad virtual summit ended, they set up 3 working groups, one to deal with a vaccine partnership where India would produce the vaccine funded by Japan and the United States, and Australia would distribute it, its aircraft. And unfortunately, India's current situation with COVID has set this program back a bit. A Quad climate working group to address that very key issue, and a Quad critical and emerging technology working group where technologies can be disruptive. And although I quoted earlier remarks that touch very broadly, maritime security in the South China Sea was not addressed directly, but it's my forecast that when the Quad leaders do meet in person, and as foreign ministers meet, we'll see a more robust program of bringing together the navies, along with partners and friends in the region, into a cooperative form to maintain maritime security. But that's a work in progress. But it's a new security architecture. And although it recognizes ASEAN centrality, I've heard on webinar involving very senior people from ASEAN, a trial balloon that instead of having the Quad try to reach out to countries like Viet Nam or the Philippines and make it difficult for them to make a choice between the Quad and China, that ASEAN itself as a regional body should meet with the new kid on the block, the new regional architecture, the Quad, and have an ASEAN +4 that would be like the ASEAN +3, which is ASEAN plus China, Japan, and South Korea. Next slide. And just to conclude, ASEAN and China since 2018 have been negotiating a draft code of conduct on the South China Sea, and I was leaked a copy, and I've written about it extensively. The COVID crisis in 2020 in particular meant no meetings of the working group responsible for this have taken place. In 2018, it was thought that it would take 3 years, that is up until this year, to reach an agreement. That hasn't occurred. They would go through 3 readings to reach the final one. Only one was held, and that was in 2019. And so what we're stuck with, and this is where the Quad could assist by helping those countries in the final phases to make sure that the code of conduct is not a paper tiger that's ripped apart, but become part of the binding normative and legal framework. But that's way into the future. The unresolved issues. What is the scope of the ASEAN-China Code of Conduct? And that hasn't been defined. How are disputes to be settled when they arise? What's the legal status? Is it a treaty? If so, it should be ratified by national parliaments and deposited with the United Nations. And at the moment, there is no role for outside or so-called third parties. China says they have no interest, but they do. And on many other treaties, like the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, you can sign protocols. And so the Quad, already its individual members have been saying the code of conduct should not contain anything that takes away from their rights or makes their security situation worse. So as the Quad itself and its members will have to reach a consensus on answering and trying to, in discussions with ASEAN, resolve those 4 issues. Otherwise, we're likely, and will very much likely see continuing through this year, the intensification of an action-reaction cycle, live firing of missiles, military exercises at sea, and close encounters between warships that could lead to danger and mishaps. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I conclude my lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a really interesting lecture, and many of the things which I think many of our students, many of the scholars in India really do not know about it and the legalities about it. But just to ask you 1 or 2 small questions, which I think the Indians are more keen on knowing, is one in terms of the BRI, which you mentioned in between. The maritime focus is basically also about the South China Sea and also about the Malacca Strait dilemma that we call it in India, which is very crucial for us. So how China is going to make spaces and deal with this, whether legally or whether with the muscular power that it has, or whether the military presence that it is going to grow. And we all know in India that Navy is one of the focus which China is really putting on. So how that is going to reshape. So that's my first question to you. So first you answer this, and then maybe we'll move to this.
Right. Well, that reference to quality infrastructure by the Quad is an idea that already had been percolating for some time, and that's all the infrastructure demands across the Indo-Pacific are so great that no combination of international financial institutions or countries or group of countries can really address them. So sometimes countries have no choice. And so one is to change, as has happened, restructure financial agencies in the 4 members of the Quad so it can play a much more active role in offering proactively now. That's the good thing, that you'll have coordination to begin to offer those offsets. Now China, because of COVID, is now, as it's reviving its contacts, its going to hold a special meeting with ASEAN foreign ministers, is trying to revive the Belt and Road infrastructure. But it's defaulted, and its economy, although it's picking up again, many questions are being made about countries that are in debt, that are having second thoughts. So this is an opportunity, I think, for the Quad members to make hay, to do some counter propaganda for once by offering stability. But the most important there is India must overcome its COVID, indeed the whole world. So that's holding and provide the vaccine that China now says it can provide because no one else is doing it. On the maritime front, though, that Indonesia's just announced major defense budget. Australia is moving up at the high end. That China has reaped what it has sown. It's created a security dilemma by pushing around, showing up, and getting into, sending ships into India's exclusive economic zones in the Indian Ocean, has seen India expel them. That this pushback, though, is no longer going to be individual. And it's not just the Quad. I'm saying that the Quad individual members can set up coalitions ad hoc. Australia and India can do something. With the US, for example, if Japan isn't going to able or won't contribute. And so there's much more flexibility, I think, in the strategic arrangements. And since Biden is not Trump, we don't have to worry about someone who might, without thinking, provoke in a way that is unlikely. So I call it a work in progress, but a very positive one, and one that can address some of the strengths that China used to promote its Belt and Road by countering it.
Yeah, I think that's where I think our Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has recently remarked that, Quad is where, it's a space which is created where the bilateral relations really do not work. So there would be a joint effort by many of the countries to create some kind of an understanding where things can work properly. But moving on to my next, question is, there's a heightened talk about India not participating in the RCEP. And RCEP is one which is going to reshape the China-ASEAN relations. So maybe that is the economic aspect which is pulling, many of the countries together in the ASEAN thing. So how is that going to reshape this whole, network of security dilemma that we are having? Whether China is going to make a leverage over that by using the RCEP, because as you just mentioned, countries are in debt. There are needs of financial support, and probably China can do that. So how do you see that?
Well, one, the entire region, let alone the globe, must recover its economic activity that was so heavily and is continuing to be impacted by COVID itself. That a country like Australia, which has been singled out for punishing tariffs and Chinese economic sanctions, will see China more constrained in a regional comprehensive economic partnership, RCEP, as you were talking about, that China will then have to play by the same rules with all the countries, or risk undermining its credibility as a trading partner itself. So there's swings and roundabouts here, and also the countries are interdependent. It doesn't need the more powerful gains. Viet Nam has a massive trade deficit with China, but needs Chinese imports in order. So we're interdependent on each other. And so the RCEP sets rules and I think constraints on China from acting in a high-handed manner. Be careful what you wish for, China. Now you've got in. Then there's the question of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the comprehensive and progressive one, where other countries are looking at it. And although I wouldn't put money that the US would quickly join, I think you see now that Britain is unhinged from Europe and can float around the world seeking its own identity, you're having countries that want to get involved. So restoring multilateralism in a multilateral system, to me, is very important. And it also can provide a balance of power against China within that venue, because all the small countries want rules that are observable, that they can mutually benefit from. So restoring supply chains, restoring buyer-seller relationships, dampening down sanctions, economic coercion that China loves so much so, are part of the framework. I don't want to wax too eloquent, but I do think the US will return to multilateralism, but may not as a major power, as a member, but it operates with all of them. But meanwhile, the countries in either overlapping groups, RCEP and TPP, as vaccines spread, as immunity begins to take over nationally, see a restoration of growth. And therefore, China, which wants its economy is growing faster first, though, will have to abide by these rules. And they were agreed eyes wide open by countries because it's a mutual benefit. So, to me, I make a more positive assessment of it than being negative. But without restoration of economic growth, then everybody is free picking for China to isolate. When the two prime ministers, Australia and New Zealand, got together with the same sheet of music on China a bit, the Chinese shot back and says, well, if New Zealand gets subject to sanctions, none of your friends are going to pick up the tab for it. And so Australia is isolated at the moment. But I think it's behavior like that that caused the New Zealand government to realize trade with China, although it's highly important, is not as important as your national sovereignty and playing by rules, and not just oh, we'll sell more agricultural product to China because Australia is hurt. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds on the economic relationships between Australia and New Zealand, but I pointed out they're not the only countries. So as COVID is receded and we get back to a pre-COVID normalcy, China's not going to be the dominant power because the US is not under Trump. The US is a much more positive one. And it's going to be working in tandem with India and Japan and Australia, and definitely with India. India is not going to be dragged down some path with the US into confrontation with China that its prime minister doesn't want. And so there's a restraint on the United States. And again, I see not the military side so much, that's very important, but the ability to coordinate, and I'm repeating the theme that I see coming out of the Quad, coordinate on major global issues, major non-traditional security issues in a coordinated way. Division of labor if necessary, which we saw with the COVID, an excellent example of that. And that's still on the cards. If India can overcome currently, it could become the producer of the COVID. And I think we're going to be taking vaccine and boosters, as I'm reading and listening to medical specialists for years to come. And in the places like the Pacific, experts have calculated the number of people there. You could vaccinate the whole South Pacific. And that would just be a tiny portion of just trying to handle Delhi as a unit. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was great listening to you. I mean, of course, rule-based order is one thing which in India we are looking for. And also about, the Prime Minister Modi has also talked about, oceans are spaces where everyone can cooperate. And so there is no need that we should engage in contestation, but security issues and dilemmas are really realities that we have to deal with. So with that words, I thank you for your time and this wonderful presentation, and hope that you stay fit with this COVID thing that is going on, and good health to you. To our viewers, please keep watching and our program and keep learning. Thank you very much. Namaste.